Science is going through a bit of a rough patch right now. Funding cuts have crippled research universities, and social media platforms are absolutely flooded with scientific misinformation. Amidst the morass of honest confusion, there are also people who are spreading disinformation, distorted, exaggerated, or misrepresented facts that are intentionally perpetuated to further some broader ideological goal. And we've got a real whopper of that for you today. Dr. Stephen Meyer has been doing the rounds on the YouTube podcast circuit promoting a new movie documentary thing called The Story of Everything, which is, according to Meyer, based on his own book Return of the God Hypothesis, published in 2021. Meyer, who has a PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge University, is a fellow at the Discovery Institute. The Discovery Institute is a think tank founded in the early 1990s that is, at least partially, focused on facilitating a public rejection of the theory of biological evolution and a public acceptance of the hypothesis of intelligent design. It's a religious and primarily Christian organization that wants to convince the public of its religious views, because if people don't believe in the Bible, then we're all gonna start acting like monkeys or something like that. They run a blog at scienceandculture.com, formerly Evolution News and Views. As you can see, this movie is a big deal to them. When a member of the DI appears on a popular news outlet or YouTube channel or something, they generally keep things very serious and objective and sciencey sounding. But when you listen to them on one of their many appearances on religious apologetics channels, they sound more like...
But it's a big answer to that, trying to say, hey, people of the church, wake up, don't sleep on this one. There is something very significant at stake here, and we don't want to baptize Darwin, because that goes down. A whole lot of dominoes fall when you do that. Why would a Christian feel as though they need to make concessions to what I consider to be one of the weakest, most pathetic scientific theories that has ever come out in the history of science? I'm on record saying that.
I want to be boring and serious for a minute here, just so I can be very clear. I don't think Dr. Stephen Meyer is trying to lie. I don't think he's consciously thinking, like, I'm gonna tell lies and to deceive the public. I don't think any of this comes from a place of malice. What I do think is that he's perfectly willing to be less careful, less rigorous, less receptive to criticism, and less precise in his language than I know he easily could be. And if I had to guess, this is because he has very strong religious convictions that ultimately supersede any commitment to serious scientific rigor that he may otherwise be able to make. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to be using a recent podcast appearance from Stephen Meyer to show you examples of how I think he misrepresents science and makes unclear or flatly untrue claims about everything from biology to cosmology to information theory.
This conference came to Dallas called Christianity Challenges the University, an international conference of atheists and theists. And I went and heard about the conference. I walked in off the street, and it was discussing the cosmological argument. It was discussing three great questions with world-class scientists and philosophers who were divided on three panels between the theists and the materialists, agnostic atheists.
Well, that's weird. The name of the conference, according to Meyer, was, quote, Christianity Challenges the University, an international conference of atheists and theists. And just now, he said you had the theists on one side, and on the other side you had the materialist agnostic atheists. The theists didn't become dualist Gnostic theists, but the atheists suddenly became materialist agnostic atheists. Yeah, but come on, you might say. This is nitpicking. If you're an atheist, you're a materialist, right? Like, they're basically the same thing? No, they are not the same thing. And here's a clip of David Chalmers, one of the most well-respected and influential philosophers of mind alive today, doing his best cosplay of the scientist guy from Independence Day, while explaining why he thinks materialism is not a viable ontology.
Well, I was trained as a scientist. My attitude was that materialism had to be true. And there was just this little problem reconciling materialism with consciousness. And only over time have I begun to think this is more and more of a problem. And in fact, maybe it's impossible to reconcile consciousness with materialism.
And Chalmers is an atheist.
Astrophysicist, cosmologist from Caltech was Alan Sandage. He took to the podium, and to the shock of many people in the audience who knew the players, he sat down with a theist and announced in his talk that he had experienced a religious conversion, well-known scientific materialist in his worldview, and announced, he gave a talk on the evidence for the origin of the universe and its fine-tuning, told his story of conversion and how it was encouraged, predicated, inspired, not in spite of the evidence, but because of the evidence.
I'm just going to assume that that's all true, because that type of thing absolutely does happen sometimes. There's no shortage of people who have decided for whatever reason later in life that there's a God after all.
I want to point out the fact that many of these things that were being discovered in science, such as Big Bang cosmology and fine-tuning and so on, preceded the new atheist movement.
Oh, right.
So my question for you is, what do you think it was that triggered the new atheist movement, and how, what did that do, and why is it now dying?
Right.
Or is maybe dead?
Of course you knew we had to talk about the new atheists and their euphoric rational skepticism and the magic sky daddy and all of that. So Meyer goes on for a little while about how things like the field of genetics just make it so obvious that atheism has been destroyed by facts and logic, and how materialism can't explain it. Sure. The part that I want to draw your attention to is this.
I know you want to be friendly to him, and that's great, but the argument's crap.
Oh, of course.
It's crap.
Yeah, there's so much to say about it, but he he's an Oxford professor at the time. He's got a lovely accent. He's very he's extremely well spoken, and he frames arguments in a way that are at least superficially very compelling.
Pay attention to what the topic is here and what the broader context is. Why were people convinced by the writings of the official Pope of Atheism, Richard Dawkins, even though the real science completely disembowels his arguments? Well, you know, he's an Oxford professor, and he does have a very smart-sounding accent. And his arguments do at least have sort of like a surface-level plausibility. So if you don't know anything about the topic, or I guess if you're just if you're just kind of dumb, then the fancy British accent, like, it can trick you into accepting it. You know what's funny about that explanation, though, is that lay people aren't the ones who are agreeing with Dawkins about the explanatory power of biological evolution. In fact, they're actually not the ones who are rejecting religious belief either. Since shortly after the publication of Origin of Species, almost every PhD-holding scientist has accepted the theory of biological evolution. The most recent survey I could find that helps to illustrate this is a Pew Research survey of AAAS. You guys got to think of a different acronym. Members from 2015. 98% of all AAAS members agree with the statement that, quote, humans have evolved over time, close quote. 99% of all PhD-holding scientists actively doing research in any field agree with that statement. 99% of experts in relevant fields like biology and organic chemistry agree as well. But Dr. Meyer, don't the world experts in biology and life sciences know about the real science that clearly debunks evolution and points to intelligent design? Is the British accent just too powerful? See, this is why people like Meyer will bring up individual examples of some scientist converting to Christianity or declaring that evolution's not real. They very clearly want you to consider this person as evidence for their position, but they don't want you to apply the exact same logic to the tens of thousands of scientists who do accept evolution and who do not accept intelligent design. You might be thinking of another tactic that describes this pretty well: cherry picking.
I'm skeptical about universal common descent, but that's not the key issue in play. The key issue in play is design or no design.
Why is that the key issue in play? What does the key issue even mean?
Is the appearance of design the product of undirected, unguided processes? That's Darwinism.
No, it's not. Darwinism is the theory formulated by Darwin, which is the theory of biological evolution via the mechanism of natural selection acting on slight variations. The postulates of the theory do not contain an entry that says, and it all has to be unguided and undirected.
I think there are a lot of atheists who want to say that the new atheist arguments were really bad.
Yes.
If I could just say one of them that I think is particularly bad, and the claim that, well, if you posit the existence of God or an intelligent designer to explain anything,
Yes.
then you violated Occam's razor because you've posited something that's more complex than the thing that you're explaining, and we need to affirm only explanations that posit more simple things.
So why is that false?
Well, first of all, just rough and ready, if that were true, it would always be wrong to posit the action of an intelligent agent to explain anything.
Pay attention to how Dr. Meyer's analogy restructures the situation. In Dawkins' original argument, even as Meyer states it, it's about positing the existence of an intelligent agent. When Meyer criticizes it, suddenly switches to positing the action of an intelligent agent. And this, of course, completely changes the argument. The relevant detail that has just been obfuscated is that we're talking about what the explanation postulates that you don't already have evidence for. So if I find a large boulder in the woods with graffiti on it that spells out Saitama Low Diffs Goku, and I propose that a human spray painted those words on it, I am not postulating the existence of humans. I am postulating a particular action conducted by something I already know exists. Meyer has a doctorate in the philosophy of science. He should know this stuff.
If I posit a single mind to explain something that someone else is coming along and positing multiple theoretical entities, as in the multiverse, and its postulation of all of the entities from string theory and all of the entities from the inflationary cosmology, positing a single God as the explanation for the fine-tuning is infinitely simpler than all of the theoretical apparatus you need in the multiverse to account for the same thing.
I hope I don't have to explain why the viability of an explanation is not determined by counting the number of things in your explanation. Atomic theory is not a bad explanation because it postulates a lot of atoms. What is being postulated is a simple rule or structure or idea from which many new things follow. That's a good property of a candidate explanation. From a simple idea, you can derive many new things that are implied by it.
There's a wonderful book by a friend and colleague, Justin Brierley in the UK, titled The Surprising Rediscovery of Belief in God. And he tells the story of the unraveling of the new atheism, that it devolved into infighting in very particular ways, because remember, all atheists should be moral relativists.
Whoa! What was that? Which one? Are they all moral relativists, or should they all be moral relativists, in your opinion? Look at how Dr. Meyer is sweeping all the inconvenient or contentious points under the rug with his language. This is the opposite of how a serious philosopher approaches questions. Just painting with a broad brush, not stopping to consider definitions or edge cases, just like, all atheists are X. Or, they should all be X, so whatever, close enough. But Dr. Meyer, only about 19% of academic philosophers are theists, and about 74% are atheist or agnostic, but 62% are moral realists. How does that work? Is Meyer really not familiar with the PhilPapers survey? Is he not familiar with the enormous amount of scholarly work in moral philosophy that develops moral realist metaethical frameworks without grounding it in God? Maybe he doesn't think any of those work, but the gall to just ignore all of it and declare that atheists should all be moral relativists as though this is a settled question and you're just obviously right and they're all just obviously wrong. If you're just going to start by assuming you're correct and their moral frameworks are all wrong, what the f is the point of making an argument in the first place?
They don't have an agreed moral framework above us all to which we can appeal to adjudicate moral differences. Very spirited fights broke out about woke, anti-woke.
Yes.
There was a kind of moral chaos that broke out within the new atheist movement because they didn't have a framework by which to adjudicate moral differences.
Really? That's why atheists disagreed on moral and political issues. Because they didn't have an objective moral framework. Is that why Christians never disagree with each other on moral issues? Because they have an objective moral framework? So if we all converted to Christianity, we could all go back to the good old days of Christian Europe, where nobody ever had any disagreements about moral issues.
And so the story of everything is told in that way. And it's essentially the story of the scientific rediscovery of the evidence that's pointing strongly to God in three different fields: in cosmology, concerning the origin of the universe; in physics, concerning the fine-tuning of the universe from the very beginning; thirdly, the story of the discovery of the nanomachinery and digital code that's been discovered inside living cells, and how that's rocked the world of many previously committed evolutionary biologists who are now thinking maybe there is evidence of design after all.
Wow, really? Like which ones? Which evolutionary biologists? Like specifically? Like how many of them? Do you have maybe like a fraction or a percentage?
Nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the f up.
You may be able to think of some public figures that speak like this. Many scientists are now agreeing. Top experts have made very significant statements in support of this. A lot of the scientists are changing their minds. Nothing is being said. It's an easy way to give people an impression or like just a general vibe of something without actually giving them any like specific beliefs that they could, check.
Science is full of unobservables. We posit things we can't see because on the assumption of their existence, we can better explain things that we can see. Now, if that's a legitimate epistemological move in the natural sciences, why can't we posit the existence of a designing mind if it happens that upon supposing such a mind, we can better explain what we do see in the physical world around us, whether it's the creation of the universe at the Big Bang or the information-bearing properties of DNA, which is what
I think I know the
to.
answer.
Yeah.
The answer is because that thing's telling me how I can and cannot have sex.
Well,
What? Like that's the reason that God isn't considered a viable hypothesis? It's because a belief in God would get in the way of all the wild orgies? We're talking about, like, theoretical physicists and microbiologists here. Like, how much sex do you think they would be having either way?
in other words, it's not a principled epistemological objection.
I think so. I think this
It
is why
isn't. It isn't a principled epistemological objection.
Right.
I don't know, dude. Like, I don't know if Meyer agrees with this or not, but wow. If you actually knew the leading researchers in physics or prebiotic chemistry or philosophy of science or whatever, like the people who devote their lives to studying this stuff, you wouldn't go on podcasts and declare that they're all ignoring the obvious correct answer to major questions in their field because they want to turn JPL and CERN into Sodom and Gomorrah.
If God had no demands on us, if we could just call him the designer or some other name and he was far removed from us, I think many people would be very willing to go along with that.
But they can just call it a designer. That's the point of intelligent design.
At the foundation of life, in the DNA molecule and in the system of information processing that's involved in expressing that information, you have a distinctive hallmark of intelligent agency. Whenever we see information and we trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. So we can characterize the phenomenon of interest. It's a kind of information that we know only arises from a mind. And so whenever we see that kind of information, it's called specified or functional information, and we trace it back to its source, whether we're talking about a computer program or a paragraph in a book or hieroglyphic inscription or information being transmitted vocally from one mind to another. If we trace that information back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life in large macromolecules like DNA is a decisive indicator of the activity of a designing mind in the origin of life.
You might want to grab a snack, because this is Meyer's main argument, his final form, his domain expansion, if you will. And we are going to go deep into this misleading, inconsistent, vague, sloppy argument. This is a modernized form of an argument that has been around for centuries, with its first major appearance generally considered to be in William Paley's book, Natural Theology, first published in 1802. The book begins with Paley constructing two hypothetical situations in which he's walking along outdoors. One in which he comes upon a rock, and another in which he comes upon a pocket watch. Paley argues that in the latter case only, he would be justified in inferring the existence of a designer of the watch. The inference to design, Paley argues, is justified based purely on the observation of how all the parts are ordered together in a meaningful and useful way to produce a clear and identifiable result. In his own words, Paley says, quote, "But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? For this reason, and for no other, namely, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, e.g., that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, or placed after any other manner or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it." Unquote. The argument given by Dr. Meyer is updated with modern language and concepts. Instead of simply saying that the parts of a biochemical structure like DNA are ordered for a purpose, Meyer says that DNA contains information, and by this, of course, he means the same thing. The parts are all working together to produce some specific higher-level function, and any small change in how the parts are arranged would disrupt the function of the system. Dr. Meyer's first claim, that whenever we see information, its ultimate source is always a mind, is not only flat wrong, it's also incredibly misleading. The reason for both of those is that there are multiple different actively used definitions of the word information. In physics, for example, information is a physical concept. It represents the range of possible values that a system can take, or possible states that a system can take. And then you've got Shannon information, which is a mathematical representation of how improbable a particular state is according to one's current knowledge, and consequently, how much new information is conveyed upon observing that state, also sometimes called the surprisal of the state. And then there's the general colloquial vibes-based definition of information, which is something like useful human knowledge. Stuff you want to know. For example, a government spy who's given the task of obtaining information about some high-ranking foreign official will be commended if she obtains video evidence of an extramarital affair or a detailed list of friends and relatives who could be blackmailed or coerced. She will not be commended if she comes back with a mathematical estimate of the number of possible states of all the electrons constituting the foreign official's body. As far as I can tell, Dr. Meyer is just assuming or hoping that everyone will interpret information in this colloquial sense, but by omitting the definition, he avoids giving the audience the impression that we should be differentiating between these types of information. So a computer program and a written letter and a DNA sequence all sound like the same thing. He wants you using intuition and generalities and assumptions. I mean, think about the argument being made in this segment.
Bill Gates, our software mogul up in the Northwest, says that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. Well, think about that. Where does software come from? It comes from a programmer.
What's being argued here? Well, look, software comes from programmers, and you know, DNA is kind of like software, so DNA must also have a programmer. Really? Because two things share, like, some similarities, then we can just assume they come from basically the same type of process? What? Imagine if I argued that, look, the sun looks like fire, and fire comes from oxidation, so the sun's heat must also come from oxidation. And I mean, to be clear, sometimes in certain circumstances, this type of reasoning can give you some reason to have a little bit more confidence. The two things might share the same common source or cause, but like as a first pass general intuition for everyday life. Not as a strong, robust, like reliable scientific argument for domains far outside of our everyday experience. And secondly, I just have to say, who the f*** cares what Bill Gates, the tech billionaire, has to say about molecular biology? Why would someone who's allegedly interested in the serious hardcore science be bringing up Bill Gates? Like, scientists at conferences are not quoting Bill Gates to defend their own views.
So based on our uniform and repeated experience, we know of only one cause that produces specified or functional information.
And this is just flatly wrong. Natural selection produces exactly this kind of information. Now, of course, Dr. Meyer will argue that he doesn't believe in Darwinism, but I don't know what to tell you. This is directly demonstrable. Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal, an actual biologist at Rutgers, has provided some great examples of this on his channel Creation Myths. I'll link the associated papers and the channel below, but for now, here he is summarizing a few papers in which random genetic sequences, subjected to random mutations and acted on by natural selection, developed new genetic information that led to new functions.
This is Yona et al. Random sequences rapidly evolve into de novo promoters. The authors replaced a gene's promoter with random sequences. Turns out, a lot of those sequences could act as a promoter. And when you let those sequences mutate, some of them became really good promoters. A bunch were even better than the original. Again, that sounds like new information to me.
Now, I am confident that I already know what Dr. Meyer would say. He would say that this doesn't actually create new functional information because we needed an intelligent agent to design and set up the experiment in the first place. I'm confident he would say this because he's used this same trick many times before.
We have been able to design some RNA molecules that will copy about 10% of themselves, but only if the bases are very specifically arranged, which means that to get a self-replicating system going, you got to have information. And where is the information coming from? It's coming from the intelligent biochemist who's doing the ribozyme engineering. And what those experiments invariably show, which is I think kind of ironic, is that to the extent that they succeed by producing molecular outcomes that are in some way life relevant. They only succeed because of extensive intelligent investigator interference. And in these simulation experiments that are used in origin of life research to simulate how you might have moved the most simple molecules in the direction of more complex molecules that are a little bit more life relevant, what is always left out of the discussion is the fact that these chemical systems are being manipulated by intelligent chemists.
Now, why is this a trick? It's a trick because Dr. Meyer is changing the requirements for what needs to be demonstrated. What Meyer said to Matt Fradd is, quote, "We know of only one cause that generates specified or functional information," unquote. Random mutation and natural selection produces specified or functional information in the sequence of nucleotide bases in question. The fact that the external parameters of the experiment have been set by an intelligent agent is irrelevant. The experimenter does not set the genetic sequence. The sequence is random. The only thing influencing the sequence is random mutation and natural selection, and it goes from being a random sequence to a functional sequence. Dr. Meyer's argument, it's like saying that the dissipation of heat requires intelligence because the experimenter's the one who heated up the object and put it in a cold environment. No, the phenomenon being tested is not interfered with by the experimenter.
We also know that the universe, as best we can tell, had a beginning.
Alan Guth, one of the most influential and well-respected cosmologists today.
The conventional Big Bang is often described as the statement that space and time came into existence at the instant of the Big Bang. That's a possibility, but it's certainly nothing that you should bet on because we really have no way of knowing.
Cosmologist and science communicator Sean Carroll.
We still don't know the answer to the question, did the universe begin? A lot of cosmologists will say there was a beginning. And the problem with this is that the prediction that there's a beginning, or the understanding that there's a beginning, is based on general relativity, and we know general relativity is not right. General relativity is not compatible with quantum mechanics, which we do think is right. So basically, we have a prediction that the universe began based on a theory we have no right to trust.
Cosmologist Niayesh Afshordi speaking to the science journalist PhilPapers.
That's certainly one of the myths that you read in the textbook, that if you take our theory of general relativity seriously, then there was a, quote, singularity, point of infinite density and infinite pressure at some time, and that's the beginning of time. But almost nobody believes that these days, because we know that theory of general relativity is not a complete theory. It misses quantum mechanics. And almost everybody believes that if you add quantum mechanics, things look different.
The poll up on screen here. So what we see is that overwhelmingly, 68% of the people that we surveyed, this was at a black hole conference. So it wasn't a cosmology conference, but it was black holes, which is a pretty adjacent field, I think. And 68% think that the phrase Big Bang should be interpreted as simply saying the universe evolved from a hot dense state. That says nothing about whether there was a beginning of time.
Dr. Meyer is not making it clear that the statements he's making aren't the consensus view of the scientific community. He's speaking with an air of scientific authority about fields completely removed from his own area of expertise, and he's making claims which are straight up false. We, quote unquote, don't know that the universe, as best we can tell, had a beginning. So next, Dr. Meyer is asked to define evolution. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to let the tape run for about a minute and a half here, and even then, I've still edited it down because he takes like 10 minutes to answer, and he gives multiple definitions, and I'm sure you will be shocked to learn that none of them are the actual standard definition that you would get from any evolutionary biologist or textbook or Google search.
There are multiple meanings of the term, and that's where a lot of confusion comes in. The most basic meaning of the term evolution is simply the idea of change over time. Okay. Do biological organisms change over time? Yeah, sure, they do. So that's not controversial. No one is disputing that. The other sense of evolution in this non-controversial sense is the idea that there are small-scale variations or adaptations of organisms to their environment within various, usually within limits. You can think of...
Yeah, give us some examples there.
Well, the famous examples are the ones that are in the textbooks, the peppered moths. And so that's evolution number one, okay? Evolution number two, second meaning, is the idea that not only has there been change over time, but that change has been continuous and effectively unlimited, such that the best way to depict the history of life is as a great branching tree, where the base of the tree it can be represented or represents one or very few simple organisms, maybe even one-celled organisms that have morphed and changed gradually to produce all the forms of life we see today. And the branches at the top of the tree represent the forms of life on planet Earth, whether the elephants or eggplants or kangaroos or all the wonderful things in Aussie land, right? And down under.
Okay.
The third meaning of evolution is that there is an unguided, undirected process known as natural selection, acting on random variations if you're a Darwinist, a classical Darwinist, or acting on random mutations if you're a more modern neo-Darwinist, that has the ability to produce all that continuous change, and that it does so without any guidance or direction.
What explains the mutations for that kind of Darwinist?
Well, there you go. I'm not even sure if that was 3 or 4 definitions, but whatever, who cares? The important part here is that he made up 2 separate definitions of evolution for small-scale changes and for large-scale changes. This is obviously not a real distinction that's made in the definition of evolution. The scientific theory of a phenomenon does not include in its postulates how extensive its effects will be. But Meyer, who again never indicates that these are his opinions and not widely accepted definitions of evolution, wants you thinking of the smaller changes and the bigger changes as separate concepts. He wants to cultivate the intuition that these are fundamentally different things, and that evidence for one does not necessarily count as evidence for the other. In reality, they're just different amounts of the same thing. Meyer may as well argue that walking in a straight line can change your location by a couple meters, but if you keep walking in a straight line for a long time, you'll never produce a macro change on the scale of something like a kilometer. The actual definition of biological evolution is change in the heritable traits of a population over time. That's it. This definition is recapitulated with slightly different phrasing throughout the field of biology. Nature.com says that, quote, evolution is defined as the change in the inherited traits of a population of organisms through successive generations. The American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology says, quote, evolution is genetic change within a population over time. Biology by Neil Campbell and Jane Rees, a popular and widely used university-level biology textbook, says, quote, in modern terms, we can define evolution as a change over time in the genetic composition of a population. UC Berkeley says on their website that, quote, biological evolution, simply put, is descent with inherited modification. Oh, and would you look at that, it also explicitly adds, quote, biological evolution is not simply a matter of change over time.
The most basic meaning of the term evolution is simply the idea of change over time.
Many things change over time. Caterpillars turn into moths. Trees lose and regrow their leaves. Mountain ranges rise and erode, but they aren't examples of biological evolution because they don't involve descent with inherited modifications, close quote. Neither do any of Dr. Meyer's definitions. How strange. Hey, Leo from the future here. This video's getting pretty long at this point, so I'm just gonna cut it off here and make a part 2. So hopefully I will see you guys in the next one.